Again, welcome, Wisconsin colleagues. This is webinar 2 in our series of instructional strategies for teaching reading foundational skills. And this evening is part 1 of 2 parts focusing on phonological awareness. And you'll notice this, we are talking about phonological awareness in service to systematic and explicit foundational reading skills instruction. Again, your facilitators in this webinar series are myself, Laura Adams, literacy consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and I'm joined by my colleague, Barb.
Hi everyone, I'm Barb Novak. I'm also a literacy consultant at DPI.
So again, these are our objectives for the series as a whole. And in the previous webinar, first webinar in this series, which you can access at the link that you see on this slide, you can access a link to the recording. You will also have access to the slide deck and all materials from that webinar. And in that first webinar, we really gave an introduction to the foundational reading skills tool. We also gave an introduction to our process for understanding reading as a complex process, and gave a little preview of what the flow of the webinar series would be like. This evening in session 2, you will be receiving some background about phonological awareness. We will be making some connections to instruction, specifically systematic and explicit instruction, which means having a scope and sequence. We will make a connection to that foundational reading skills tool. We will provide some examples situated within a gradual release of responsibility instructional framework. And we will give some examples of not only some instructional practices, but some assessment tools for progress monitoring of phonological awareness. And we are very excited to be able to share some real Wisconsin classroom examples with you this evening. Again, all materials for this session can be found at this link on your screen, and you will be able to access the recordings of this webinar at the link that you see on this screen as well. When you're accessing this link, capitalization does matter. The hyperlink, the address is case sensitive. For Wisconsin schools and districts, implementing an equitable multi-level system of supports means providing equitable services, practices, and resources to each learner based upon how they respond to the instruction and interventions that we provide to them. And we're going to situate phonological awareness within our equitable multi-level system of support. And we see that as really fitting into the area of high quality instruction, as well as strategic use of data. And we hope that our examples that you'll be engaging with this evening make that clear. We want to offer some cautions as we engage in this learning together. First of all, reading is a complex process, and so isolating one area of reading foundational skills to focus on is a little artificial and ultimately can be dangerous. It can not achieve the results that we ultimately want for our students, which is what the results of the Reading First study showed us. So we also want to show that the National Reading Panel report did not ever focus on the larger umbrella of phonological awareness and all of the sub-skills that fall under that umbrella. And so we're talking about a number of hours of just phonemic awareness that should take place over kindergarten and grade 1. And you can access an additional resource, the report that Shanahan gave, providing some examples and the guidance of hours of instruction, broken down into even minutes per day in the report that's hyperlinked here. And again, we really feel like we can't stress enough the fact that schools and districts need to engage in professional learning on all areas of literacy. What you're seeing on your screen now, again, is a model representing the reading process, and this was introduced in the first webinar in the series. Again, our larger goal is there in that largest blue oval at the end, reading comprehension. And to achieve that goal, we need fluency and context, language comprehension, and strategic knowledge. And when we're talking about phonological awareness, we're talking about one of the skills in that top blue line, which leads to fluency in context. So the instructional practices that we are talking about this evening need to be systematic and explicit. And so you've heard us use that phrase quite a bit. What makes instruction systematic? That means that we have a scope and sequence. And what makes instruction explicit? It means that we are very clearly providing instruction and information. And we're going to do that within one particular instructional framework. In this case, that is the gradual release of responsibility model, because that allows us to provide a clear and memorable instruction, followed by supported, guided practice. And it also means that teachers are always using precise language that enable our students to complete the tasks or the learning or the practices successfully. And the goal is always self-regulated, independent practice. So at this point, if you're watching the recording, we invite you to stop and pause the recording to think or talk about these questions. You could do that by doing some independent reflective writing. You could do that even better by having a discussion with your colleagues, or you could do that as part of a larger professional learning activity, again, with your colleagues in your own local context.
So let's dig into phonological awareness by talking about some background information, a definition, and some explanation of why phonological awareness is so important. We have a ton of information about phonological awareness, way more information than would fit in the 60-minute time slot that we have for today. So the information that we're providing in the slide deck and additional quotes and information for your thinking are provided in this supplementary background information. It's a multi-page handout. Laura, is it linked if they click on the image?
Yes, correct. The image is linked, and you'll also find it in the public folder.
Perfect. So that's a resource that you can use, a little gift with purchase, a little bonus that you can use in addition to the slide deck. So let's start with a definition of phonological awareness. For me, the most important thing to remember about phonological awareness is that it is all about the sound. In the word phonological, I hear at least part of the word phone. Not that phones look like this anymore, but I hear part of the word phone. And that's how I remember that phonological has to do with sound. Because when we're in a phone conversation, you can hear the person, but you can't see the person. So when we're talking about phonological awareness and the continuum of skills that are part of phonological awareness, we are not talking about print. We are just talking about sound. And phonological awareness does follow a predictable continuum of skill development. And we'll be talking about this more when we get to the section about scope and sequence. It's actually something that's developing even from birth. as children learn how to distinguish the differences in sound between the voices of the caring adults around them. When they can hear the difference between cars that pull into the driveway as their skills sort of start to refine. All of that sound work is part of phonological awareness. And then it becomes part of pre-reading skills, like hearing the number of words in a sentence, hearing when words rhyme. So here's some examples of pre-reading skills. Developing the concept of a spoken word. For example, my name is Fatima is a sentence for one that has 4 words in it. But since we're talking about phonological awareness, we would want learners to be able to pick out those 4 words just from hearing the sentence, not from seeing the sentence. Phonological awareness also involves rhyme, such as I saw a mouse in my house. And then it starts to develop into phonemic awareness and more complicated, complex skills like deletion, that's sort of the most complex of the skills, deleting syllables within a word. And we'll get more into those phonemic awareness skills and the complexity of that in webinar 3. Now, it is pretty artificial to think that phonological awareness always happens completely without print. There are times when we're working on phonological awareness that we do use print, and you'll see that in a video example that we look at later today. And further, there's not a time where all of a sudden you are phonologically aware and you start working on phonics. Like, it doesn't really work that way. There's not like a stopping line and a starting line. The young children are working on many skills at one time. And when we get to the part about scope and sequence, we'll also talk about how some students might be developing skills that are further along in the continuum before they're completely secure in those things that are earlier in the continuum. That's the beauty of young learners, right? We're able to watch them learn and grow in the ways that are unique to them. So here's the other thing about phonological awareness that I think is really critical. It is highly related to later success in reading and spelling. And it's not something, Laura, can you switch to the next slide? It's not something that for most young children necessarily develops on its own. It is something that for most children, especially our learners who might struggle, it is something that has to be explicitly taught. So it is an incredibly important skill because it is predictive of later success, and also something that has to be explicitly taught. Now, luckily for all of you as early childhood educators, it is a skill that can be incredibly fun and joyful and creative to develop in a play-based way in the early grade classrooms. And it is a lot about developing an interest in language through joyful and developmentally appropriate activities. However, the activities have to be carefully planned. Remember, we're talking about explicit and systematic instruction. So the skill that a particular activity is developing fits within your understanding of readers' development, where they are in their development as readers, and it has to involve explicit instruction in that particular skill through modeling, most likely by a knowledgeable adult, guided practice, and independent practice where the adult can provide corrective feedback, followed by independent application of the skill. So although it is joyful and creative, it's not, we're not like all willy-nilly just doing stuff that we found on Pinterest or Teachers Pay Teachers. We are making really intentional choices about how to engage students in this joyful kind of learning in order to continue their development in phonological awareness. So if you are watching the recording of this webinar, we encourage you to stop at this time and pause the video to think a little bit about where you are in your current learning about phonological awareness, and also to think a little bit about where your system is. Remembering that we're not just talking about classroom teachers or reading teachers or literacy coaches. We're talking about all of the teachers that work with students, including teachers who specialize in students with IEPs and teachers who specialize in students who are learning English as a second or other language.
So now that we have provided some background knowledge about phonological awareness, let's talk a little bit about systematic instruction. And again, when we're talking about systematic instruction, what we mean is that we have a scope and sequence. So within a scope and sequence of systematic instruction, we know that there is a general progression of how children develop these skills. And so what you see here on the left side of your screen in that blue box, we see some dot points about those phonological awareness skills that are earliest to develop. So, and what we're talking about here, those are the smaller linguistic units, some easier tasks, as well as those global aspects, like syllable awareness. We also know that we have 3 different task categories within phonological awareness. And these, in order of difficulty, are first of all detection. And that's just being able to identify in similar sounds. And so we can go back to that example that Barb gave us about rhyming. I see a mouse in the house. The second task category, a little bit more difficult, is synthesis. And what we mean there is blending of smaller linguistic units, or being able to produce examples. Production, we know, right, is a more advanced skill. And then finally, we have analysis. And when students are engaging in analysis, that means that in this case, they're able to manipulate linguistic units or produce additional examples. So for example, when we start asking students to take off a particular onset and replace it with another onset to create a new word, then we're talking about manipulating the linguistic units within a word. Within the scope and sequence of phonological awareness, we want to remind you that although there is a general progression of skills, that does not mean that students need to be completely secure in one skill before we move on to providing explicit, very clear instruction in the next skill or the next level of complexity within those 3 tasks that we were just talking about. These skills can be concurrently taught within the curriculum. For example, concepts about print will be taught within the same time cycle of learning as phonological awareness. So we're thinking in terms of both and, not either or. And likewise, at the same time that we're building up a child's phonological awareness, we're building up their vocabulary, their sense of story through interactive read-alouds. So that's one way that we can provide learning that is both explicit, intentional, and multidimensional. So again, going back to our model representing the reading process, we can see where phonological awareness and where phonemic awareness are situated. And again, just a reminder that we will be zooming into more phonemic awareness in the 3rd webinar. Again, we just want to point out that although there's a general progression of skills, and there should be a scope and sequence to how we're providing instruction in phonological awareness, that those skills can be taught concurrently. They develop in overlapping phases, not discrete stages. And so children can demonstrate more complex levels of phonological awareness even as they're mastering less complex ones. We want to always be providing multiple daily opportunities for students to play with, to use, to manipulate language in service to developing phonological awareness. As Barb was saying earlier, this should be a joyful process. These should be activities that really promote curiosity about language and having fun with language. And these should also be, these can be rhymes, songs, silly stories. These are all examples of ways that we can engage in developing phonological awareness with our youngest learner. And again, we have this quote from Yap and Yap, which reminds us that although instruction generally progresses from larger to smaller units of sound, it's not a lockstep progression of skills. Children do not need to master one level before being exposed to other more complex levels of phonological awareness. We want to remind you that while some students will pick up these skills with relative ease, especially if the curriculum that you're using includes explicit activities, there are other students who need to be taught these metalinguistic skills more directly and more systematically. And within certain academic research, it has been found that without direct instructional support, roughly 25% of middle-class children and even larger numbers from children from less economically advantaged homes will fail to develop this crucial understanding, which ultimately impacts their reading comprehension abilities. So this is a reminder of what you can find in Appendix 2 from Wisconsin Standards for English Language Arts 2020. So you'll see that resources in that Appendix 2 of our Standards for English Language Arts shows us the general progression as well as some examples of phonological awareness. And this slide, again, also gives us some examples of the kinds of resources that we can find in Appendix 2 that help us both develop our understanding of phonological awareness and gives us some resources for that systematic and explicit instruction. This is a screenshot from the Wisconsin Standards for English Language Arts 2020, just to show you where within the standards phonological awareness shows up. You can see that they are found within the reading foundational standards, and that's what the RF is on the screen here. And we can see that progression, again, show up within the individual grade level. So we can see here how the skill is meant to develop, what our goals are for our students in 5K, what our phonological awareness goals are for students in grade 1, and the goals that we have for students in grade 2. So again, this is a place where if you're watching the recording, we invite you to pause, to stop and think about what have you learned or what's been reinforced for you about phonological awareness. To what extent is this information known and used within your system? And even more importantly, how do you know? What's your evidence? And what additional professional learning might be needed?
Thanks, Laura. We've done a definition of phonological awareness, remembering there that this is about sound and not about print. We've talked about how this is a skill that's predictive of success in later reading, and looked at some research that said that for 25% of students, this is not a skill that develops on its own. It's something that needs developed through explicit and systematic instruction. We've taken a look at the scope and sequence and how that is supported by Appendix 2 and Wisconsin Standards for English Language Arts. Let's next take a look at the Foundational Reading Skills tool. As a reminder, this is a self-evaluation or a systems evaluation tool that was introduced in Webinar 1. So it is linked on a website that was provided earlier. And let's zoom in on the instructional practices and phonological processing as part of a complex system, because phonological awareness does show up in both of those places. Part one is about the instructional practices, and you see a couple of examples on the screen. This is not the complete list. These are a couple of things from the first that are specific to phonological awareness. And then you also see, do we teach phonological processing as one part of a complex theory of reading, with the idea of explicitly and systematically teaching for mastery. So part one is really about the practices that educators use in the classroom. And part two is about the content. That the practices are being used to teach the knowledge and skills that we want students to be proficient in as a result of the instruction. So let's talk about that instruction. Talk about some specific instructional practices and how they can be used within a gradual release of responsibility to engage students in explicit and systematic instruction. So as a reminder, we are talking about one tiny little part of the overall model representing the reading process. We're zooming in on that phonological awareness. And if the instruction is explicit, it's using explanation, modeling, guided practice, collaborative, and independent practice. So in this case, it's using gradual release of responsibility to ensure that every student has access to that explanation and modeling, along with guided practice, collaborative practice, and independent practice, where corrective feedback can happen to ensure that every student is working towards independence in a skill. That can be provided in whole group, small group, or individual settings. And I can't emphasize enough here that we're really talking about an intentional planning process. And one of the things that allows that planning process to be intentional is for every educator to have a deep understanding of that scope and sequence that Laura just talked about, that typical skill, typical continuum of development of skills. Both so that whole group instruction can be based on that typical continuum, but also so that the teacher can engage students in formative assessment, which we'll talk more about in a bit, in order to ensure that instruction can be personalized to really meet the needs of the students and where they are in their development as readers. A lot of this phonological awareness work is really about language play. We can accomplish this by playing with words, playing with rhymes, playing with verses, playing with songs, and really encouraging students to make up ways to change those rhymes and verses and songs. And we provide them with support so that the changes that are being made fit within that continuum, fit within that scope and sequence. You might consider using language other than English as it's found in children's books, or as it might allow the identities of students in your class to be better represented. I would encourage you to really, really do your research and make sure that you understand what you're saying and what you're doing when you're using language from another culture. So as an example, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, pretty classic game or activity. You can very easily make that into a phonological awareness activity by changing the first sound or the onset of the words. So for example, if you were working on the sound "b," you could ask children to replace the first sound in each word with the sound "b." So head, shoulders, knees, and toes becomes bed, boulders, bees, and bows. And they'd be able to point to the parts of their body as they're saying that. If the students are more complex in their development, you can leave off the onset and just sing the rhyme. And you can see the example of that on the screen. So we are talking, as we've mentioned at other parts in the series, we are talking about instruction provided in English in universal instruction. But we know that within universal instruction, we have to plan, welcome and celebrate and plan for diversity in our learners, whether those are students with IEPs or students with English as a second language, or students who are significantly younger than their peers or significantly older than their peers. There's a lot of reasons why we need to not only differentiate, but also plan for difference. And formative assessment is really critical there. So here are some ideas for differentiation at the whole group level. One I really want to highlight here is developing some kind of a communication system with specialists. Maybe that's a special ed teacher, an EL teacher, a reading interventionist, so that there's a real solid system for communicating what you're seeing in the classroom with teachers who might be working with the student either in the classroom or another environment to ensure that consistency of services. I'll have you keep going, Laura. If you are watching the recording of this, we do encourage you to stop and think or write or draw or talk about the topics that you see on the screen now. So the goal of any instructional strategy that we choose and the goal of overall reading foundational skills instruction is transfer. Transfer to reading, writing, and speaking. One of the ways that we do that is through, Laura, can you go back for me, please? One of the ways that we do that is through instruction that's systematic, that follows a predictable scope and sequence, instruction that's explicit, which we're talking about achieving through gradual release, and intentionally planning for teaching application, intentionally teaching for application and transfer. So here is a review of the gradual release model. The educator names the target. The educator provides a rationale for the target. The educator demonstrates the skill or strategy to be learned, and then slowly the responsibility for that learning is handed over to the student through guided and collaborative practice, and finally through independent practice. How long we stay in each one of those phases really depends on how well students are understanding the content. You might have some students that need more guided and collaborative practice, while other students are ready to move on to independent practice. And the educator is always planning for what sort of prompting and support they may need to be providing along the way. So let's look at an example from a classroom with a game called Stand, Sit, Turn Around. And the basic idea of this game is that students are practicing identifying syllables, specifically identifying the number of syllables in their names. So the explicit skill that has to be taught is that words have syllables and that we're able to detect or hear the number of syllables within a word. So in the whole gradual release of responsibility, there has to be some explicit teaching that happens before the game, stand, sit, turn around, happens as independent practice. So you can see the language that the teacher might use to name the skill and the rationale. And then you see the teacher engage in very brief but effective explicit modeling. If we're talking about names and syllables, you see an example there on the screen. Then moving into guided practice, collaborative practice with corrective feedback as needed. And that's where the game, stand, sit, turn around, can really come in. Within the collaborative practice, the guided practice, and the independent practice. So we're taking an activity that involves movement and fun and a little bit of play, but we're providing very quick, explicit teaching before students use the activity to reinforce the skill and to really gain some independence with the skill. I just want to remind you that kids need repetition to learn these skills. So, and what's secure one day might not be secure in the afternoon or might not be secure the next day. So we can play variations on these games with clap, snap, and tap, really just being the same game, but with different motions. So let's take a look at an example from a classroom. This is a 5K teacher in September using the names of students as a way to practice the syllable identification part of phonemic awareness. And you do see the teacher use a little bit of print because, like we said, although phonological awareness is auditory and not visual, there are some times where it's appropriate to show some print.
Here we go. Who is this? That's all right. Here we go. Are you ready? Ready? School came to school today. School today. School today. Look who came to school today. Our friend Desiree. So boys and girls, we have been working a lot with all of our names, correct? Yes. And we've been looking at the first letter of the name, and we've been singing songs to help us remember the names, and we've been using the names to talk about the letters and the way letters look and the sounds that they make. And we made a name chart over here. Remember the name chart? So let's go through and say our names. Here we go. Ready? Julianne, Imogen, Avery, Bernard, Serenity, Desiree. Today we're going to use our names again. And this time we're going to talk about syllables. It's a really good word, isn't it? I'm going to show you how it's spelled. This is the word syllables. Yeah. Syllables. Syllables mean parts. How many parts that we can hear in a word? Because when we know how many parts, it helps us to be able to read the words. Okay? So this is our learning target for today. We're going to listen for the syllables. We're going to hear and listen for the different parts in a word. And we're going to use our names to help us with that. So I'm going to show you what I mean. Here, I want you to listen so you can hear how many parts are in the word. I'm going to raise a finger when I say my name for the parts. Here we go. Ready? Liz. How many parts is that? One. Yeah, look. It's one. Then I'm going to clap when I say my name. Listen and watch. Ready? Liz. How many times I clap? One. I can even stop it. Are you ready? Now watch. Here we go. Liz. How many times did I stop? One. Some names have two parts. Some words have two parts. I'm going to say someone's name in this room. I'm going to raise my finger, and then I'm going to clap it. You can tell me if it's two parts. Ready? Transverse. How many? Two. Tre. This is the first part. Verb. This is the second part. Let's clap it. Let's clap it. You want to clap it with me? Transverse. How many times have we clapped? Two. Let's stomp it. Ready? Transverse. How many times can we stop? Two. Very good. All right. So some of them will have three or four. It just depends. So we have this little name. All right. So I'm going to say a name. I'm going to show you a name card. And then we're going to count out how many it is. Okay? Who is this? When we say a part, one finger will go up. Ready? Sophia. How many parts? 3. I'm going to write it right here. So, 3. Let's clap it. Ready? Sophia. How many? 3. Let's stop it. Ready? Sophia. How many stops? 3. All right. Are you ready for the next thing? I'm going to give you a partner. Probably just the person right next to you. And you're going to take turns with your partner, and you're going to listen. You're going to raise your finger, and you're going to clap their name for the part. Then you're going to have to, when we come back together, you're going to have to tell me how many parts were in your partner's name. Your name. Linda. Try it again, watch. Linda. Now do it with me, Linda. Linda. How many parts are in Linda's name? Do it together. All right, now let's put the diet. Ooh, try it again. Yeah, you gotta do it. How many was that? 3. Good. Do it again. All right. Did anybody have a partner who had more than 3 parts? How many, Sophia, who was your partner? And how many parts did Amelia have? She said he had 4. Let's try that one. Let's clap it first. Ready? How many is that? 4. Let's stop it. Ready? 4. I'm going to show you how that's divided. There it is. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So in that real-time example, we see a 5K teacher with kiddos with masks on, still in face-to-face instruction, working through phonological awareness. And I think an example like this is something that does translate, if you're doing live virtual instruction, would translate into live virtual instruction using breakout rooms or using a whip around or some other kind of procedure for the guided practice section that still would allow the kids to interact with each other. And if you're in an asynchronous environment, you could certainly pre-record the lesson about syllables and have students practice with the names of members of their family. They could provide you with an audio recording of them saying the names and clapping the syllables. So if you are watching the recording of this, we encourage you to stop at this point and process the video and the teaching points a bit more. The next slides do go over specific moves that Liz made that are examples of both explicit and systematic teaching. And you have the slide deck so that you'll be able to review those slides on your own. So again, the goal of teaching reading foundational skills is that students are able to apply what they're learning in their reading and their writing. So let's talk about that idea of intentionally teaching for application and transfer. Application and transfer does have to be something that is explicitly taught, especially for our learners who might struggle with executive processing and generalizing from one environment to the other. Let's look at another example from Liz's classroom where she is really artfully engaging the students using a read aloud in teaching for transfer.
Let's do our fingers and let's do piano. Ready? Piano. How many parts? 3. What classic is saxophone? How many parts? 3. How about drum? Ready? Drum. 1. All right. I want you to sit, and I'm going to read you a story called "My Mouth is a Volcano." My mouth is a volcano. Written by Julia Cook. That's the author. What does the author do? Writes the words for the story. Illustrated by Carrie Hartman. What does the illustrator do?
Draw the
Picture. What do you see coming out of this person?
fire.
Fire. So they're saying his mouth is a volcano, and we know volcanoes blow up, don't they? And fire comes up. Let's learn. Let's see what we learned about syllables. Hands on our left. And let's see how many syllables are in the word volcano. Are you ready? Volcano. Let's do our fingers. Ready? Volcano. How many? 3 parts. Here we go. My name is Lewis. People say I erupt a lot. I don't think I do. I have a lot to say, and all of my words are very important to me. When other people talk, words just pop into my head and then they slide down onto my tongue. My tummy started to rumble and then it started to grumble. My words began to wiggle and then they did the jiggle. My tongue pushed all of my important words into my teeth and my whole volcano erupted.
What is he saying?
What's he saying? He's saying, "Teacher, I think we should have races all day on number 2. Can we go to watch now?" And she's trying to teach. Is he helping them to learn when he shouts out like that? No. Is he interrupting the learning?
Yeah.
Interrupting, that's a big word. Let's do that with those word parts. Ready? Interrupting the word. It's a big word. It means we need to wait patiently. My teacher was less than pleased. She erupted me right back. I know what you are saying is very important to you, Lewis, but since it is not an emergency, you'll have to wait until I call on you. It was my volcano. Can we control when we talk?
Yeah.
Can you say in your head, I have to wait my turn and I can't talk right now? You can. You can. But what if it's an emergency? What if Lyndon was by the door and she fell and hit her head? What do you think Mom would say if she was talking to Dad and you interrupted?
She would put us on a timer.
She would say, you need to wait your turn.
Or put you on a timer.
Lewis, my mom said, you interrupted. I'm dead. If somebody else is talking and you don't have an emergency, you have to wait your turn. But Mom, I work this right up for my head, onto my tongue, and then my tummy starts to run. Lewis, you just did it again. Did he interrupt Mom while she was trying to talk?
Yeah.
I got sent to my room. She said I was rude. It was my volcano. There's more to our story. We're going to find out if he learns how to control that volcano. So thumbs up if you think he's going to learn how to control his volcano. Thumbs down if you think he's not going to learn. We're going to finish it when we come back from art. Right now, I want you to remember what it should look like when you walk to that door.
A big, big thank you to Liz and her students for providing us with that little glimpse into their classroom. One of the things I especially appreciate about the Teaching for Transfer that we just witnessed was that such a small part of it was about phonological awareness. But by taking that small amount of time to really intentionally talk about a skill that was taught explicitly and out of the context of a book, to really start a lesson with a book by talking about that skill and helping students see the connection between the two lessons, that prompts students for transfer. In addition to that, it's just a really rich lesson about developing vocabulary and a little bit about social emotional learning as well. So we do have some suggestions of texts that might support you in teaching for transfer when you're focusing specifically on phonological awareness. Again, here are some questions to stop and think about if you're watching the recording. So we're really fortunate to be joined tonight by Jackie Hines, who works in the school that was featured in those videos from within the school district of Nakusa. And Jackie's going to tell us a bit about her school's focus on transfer theory. Thank you so much for your time, Jackie.
Thank you, Barb. Just wanted to give you just a little background on our school. So Nakusa, Liz, the kindergarten teacher, is one of 4 kindergarten teachers. We have a 4K3 building. And so as a literacy coach, we're always looking at our data and assessing our kids to kind of focus on like, what do we want to really boost up for our kids. And we know that our kids a lot of time come with needs in language and literacy development. So we looked at our curriculum to see like what are some areas that we need to focus on. We looked at our scope and sequence and continuum and really wanted to zoom in on those areas of phonemic awareness, concepts of print, those kind of things early in the year. And looked at our phonics program, which kind of starts out with kids' names. And so we were really intentional with that. So you can see in the video in week 3, the kids already know each other's names and could link the new information to what we were trying to teach in something that's known, because we know that if we work from known to new, it's very easy for the brain and learning to take place. So again, you know, we looked at like, okay, we're teaching this lesson, but how do we make sure that those kids are able to take it from this lesson to the next lesson to whatever they're working on? So very intentionally looking at, okay, we're going to teach it here in this piece. And then there's echoes throughout the day so that those kids know that, it works here and it works here and it works over here too. So really focusing on whatever we're working on, that we've got those echoes throughout the lesson, and helping kids to see that it's not just here where that learning takes place. And I think too, that by purposefully looking at like, where can I make this link? And, you know, with her read aloud book, taking those words that we're going to be probably revisiting throughout the year. So taking it into something very meaningful that they're going to be coming across over and over again. So really looking at our lesson planning and being intentional about how we're going to teach and where we're going to teach it. And then you can see from the lessons that it was fun. The kids had fun with all the pieces. And so it's so easy to just incorporate that into everyday things that we're doing, but more intentionally. So that's kind of our story for this year. Thanks, Barb.
Oh, thank you, Jackie. And send our thanks to Liz as well. I just want to highlight the intentionality here. I know I've used that word a lot in this particular session, but this doesn't happen on accident. Liz was specifically looking for opportunities to extend that phonological awareness lesson about syllables into printed text, and chose a text that would allow her and support her in doing that. Now, we did originally say that this would be a 1-hour webinar, and you will notice that we are at the 1-hour mark. If you're viewing live and you need to leave at this point, we completely understand and will not be offended. The recording should be posted hopefully within a week, but it could take closer to 2 weeks just based on the amount of video that we're posting right now. So if you need to leave, please do so, but we are going to continue on with a last couple points about phonological awareness. If you're watching the recording of this learning, we do encourage you to stop at this point and think or talk with colleagues about teaching for transfer of phonological awareness. I just feel like I want to say one more thing. There are a lot of places that use supplemental programs, purchased programs or open source programs for phonological awareness or phonics or other aspects of concepts of print. You still need to think through this idea of intentionally teaching for a transfer. There is no program that does that for you. There is no supplemental program that does that for you. You have to understand what's being taught, the concept that's being taught in the lesson, and seek out ways to extend that into other parts of your day.
So again, the importance of intentional decisions, just a few last talking points about that. We know that there are lots of activities and games that are out there and that our teachers of our youngest learners use all the time. And we just can't emphasize enough how important it is to intentionally use those activities and games as part of your systematic and explicit instruction in phonological awareness. And so that means that you are choosing activities and games that follow a scope and sequence. And where does that scope and sequence come from? It comes from what we know from the research about how phonological awareness develops, that progression of skills, that progression in complexity of tasks. Also remembering that there are overlaps in those progressions. And so we are not boxed into some kind of a lockstep progression there. And so we are using both what we know about how phonological awareness develops, as well as using formative assessment data about what we know about our students and their levels of phonological awareness. And that's how we make the decisions that we make about what games and activities to use in our classrooms. We know that you can find activities and games in lots of places, and we also have some resources available to you. And so you can access the slide deck to click this link in order to find additional activities and games that will develop those phonological awareness skills that are so important ultimately to reading comprehension.
Laura, can I just interject one thing? We skipped some slides in the live version of the presentation that you all can see in the actual slide deck. And one of those slides reminds you that many of the apps and online resources that you find don't teach, they just practice. So remember, we're saying, it's a weird sun situation going on at my house right now. Remember, we're saying that we have to be explicit about our teaching. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a kid practice something in independent practice that you haven't provided explicit teaching and corrective feedback on, because otherwise the student is playing a game and not really truly understanding that there is a skill there that readers apply. So especially in this virtual learning environment when parents are looking for things to keep their kids occupied, or you're looking for things to keep students working so that you can work with small groups, do take into consideration whether or not students have had actual instruction in the skill that the game is reinforcing.
Again, there are additional resources, free resources for phonological awareness games that you can access here. And here is where we again invite you to pause and reflect on these questions related to the resources that you use to develop phonological awareness. also invite you to consider how you engage families in the development of phonological awareness skills. And here are some ways that you can do that. These are some suggestions or invitations that you can pose to the families that you are working with. There are additional examples at this link that you can follow. And now Barb is going to lead us into the final section of our webinar today, talking about, oh no, actually, I take it back. It's me. I am leading you into the final section.
Maybe we can do it together.
Yeah. Yes, where we're going to provide some examples of assessment practices in order to monitor and evaluate the phonological awareness of our youngest learners. So again, the purpose of assessment, the whole purpose of assessment is to give educators real-time data, real-time information that we can use in order to inform and guide our instruction, in order to plan relevant activities that will further develop their skills. And so we are always asking ourselves, how do we strategically use data to provide varying types of supports at different levels of intensity in order to adjust to the needs of the whole child that is in front of us. And we also want to offer this reminder of the social aspect of learning. Learning is always social. And so that also needs to be part of any of our assessment considerations. We again want to remind you of Wisconsin's vision of a strategic assessment system. And just as in session 1, we talked about how one assessment can serve multiple purposes. For example, if your district is using PALS as an assessment of reading readiness, that assessment can also be used for interim assessments and summative assessments, as well as formative assessments to guide grouping and the instruction that needs to happen within those different grouping contexts. In addition, supplemental tools within PALS can be used for the monitoring of progress and for formative assessment. And so having a valid and reliable assessment for multiple purposes allows us to minimize the time that we spend on assessment so we can really get to the instruction. And our focus, of course, is on formative assessment because that should be the largest part of our assessment system, and we should use it to quickly inform our instruction. It should give us quick and immediate specific feedback that we can use to respond to our students in the moment. And so we're going to provide some examples. Some examples of formative assessment might be anecdotal notes that we jot down during instruction. It could be photographs that we take. It could be audio recordings, could be student drafts. And so again, I'm thinking about our transition to virtual instruction and how we can use some of those pieces of virtual instruction as formative assessment. We can ask families to take pictures and send them to us. We can ask families to take some recordings of games that they're playing together with language, and we can use that as formative assessment.
I think one of the things that's really key here that also seems to be another theme besides just intentionality is that educators need to be experts. They need to know what they're looking for in formative assessment. So they need to understand the continuum sort of the scope and sequence of how phonological awareness is likely to develop. They need to understand what that looks like in student talk, and they need to be providing students with tasks where they can demonstrate what they know about that. For example, I would guess that when Liz was asking students to clap out the word volcano, she heard the extra claps and she knew which students those were coming from. That's formative assessment. It's a cue for you as an educator that you need to check back in with that student. And we'll show you some examples of how to keep track of that type of assessment. As far as, I'm going to let you keep going, Laura.
Yep. So it's important to have a flexible system that you can use to document that formative assessment, that information that you are seeing and hearing in real time. And some examples include checklists, anecdotal notes, again, photographs, audio recordings, or student drafts. And so here is one example, and this is a sample checklist. A checklist with specific look-fors where you can simply just put an X check mark, or you can code it in any way that makes sense for you based on what it is that you're trying to document. And here is another example of a sample checklist. Notice that you need to first decide what is it that you're trying to collect data on. What information are you looking for from your students? Decide on those expected skills or the stages, and that's what goes into the checklist. And then that's what allows you to document sometimes multiple times for the same skill. Again, going back to what we know about learning and the progression of learning with our youngest students. So again, we invite you to pause the recording, stop and think or talk about the assessments that you currently have in your system. How could you strengthen the formative assessment portion of your system, especially the assessments that you use to measure phonological awareness? What tools do educators use to organize and analyze that data? How can your system be strengthened? And how can educators actually use that formative assessment data to guide their instruction?
Yeah, and I think as an individual or as a system, when you're deciding, when you're intentionally choosing, designing a lesson and choosing a game or activity to go into it, really asking yourself, what is it that students are going to say and do during this activity? And how can I use what students are saying and doing? How can I use that as data about what I want to do next? And there might be some students that you find yourself really documenting that closely for. There might be other students that you feel are really progressing smoothly based on other data, and you might, for those students, not need to do quite as much documentation. Thank you. Thank you all for your commitment tonight to this sort of marathon of phonological awareness. So here is where we have been today. We have gone from definitions and background information, really remembering that phonological awareness is the phone and it's just the sound, into the scope and sequence, the development, the typical development of phonological awareness skills, remembering that these skills are often developing for students simultaneously, but that for a large portion of students, at least 25%, these skills do not develop without explicit instruction. We've reminded you of the first and some places within the first where phonological awareness is mentioned. We gave some examples of instructional practices and how they can be used within a gradual release of responsibility. We gave you a whole bunch of resources that you can use to learn some new tricks for joyously teaching phonological awareness. And finally, we've talked about some assessment tools for progress monitoring. And that progress monitoring that we're talking about is just monitoring of progress. It's not any sort of we're not talking about the kind of progress monitoring that's required in an SLD eligibility decision. We're talking about casual progress monitoring that a teacher uses to group and regroup students and decide which lessons might need more emphasis. So this webinar is part 2 of a 6-part series. In the next webinar, webinar 3, we will focus on phonemic awareness. That is that place where the National Reading Panel anticipates spending, I believe the number is 5 to 18 hours over kindergarten and first grade. So we'll follow the similar format that we did today, where we provide you with some background information and some research. We'll talk about the scope and sequence, make some connections to the first, talk about strategies, instructional practices for explicit instruction. We'll have some more video for you and a voice from a school. And then we'll talk about assessment tools for progress monitoring. Again, casual progress monitoring with the purpose of guiding instruction. You have our contact information here. We really do love hearing from you, and this time of pandemic makes it easier than ever to just pop in for a quick visit with you through Zoom or Skype or Teams or Google Hangout or whatever new platform might get invented tomorrow. So we really are here to be supportive of you, and a huge thanks to Jackie and Liz from NACUSA. We really appreciate the opportunity to spotlight your work.